On Sunday, the 29th of June at 06:54 local time, November 441 Lima Sierra, a Cessna Conquest twin-engine turboprop aircraft went down shortly after takeoff from Ohio's Youngstown-Warren Regional Airport. Here's what little information we know right now, and we've got a lot of information on the unique systems to the Cessna Conquest aircraft that investigators are going to be looking at during this accident investigation. There were a total of 6 people on board this aircraft. There were no survivors. This video, as always, is brought to you by the people that support this channel here on Patreon. Thank you for your support. This accident occurred Sunday morning about 7 local time in Ohio. The aircraft is a 1984 Cessna 441 Conquest. That's the twin turboprop Cessna aircraft that's powered by the Garrett TPE 331 turboshaft engines. A lot more on that coming up shortly. 6 fatalities, 6 occupants. The aircraft crashed just 2 kilometers off the end of the runway after departing runway 32 out of Ohio's Youngstown Warren Regional Airport. The weather at the time of the accident was good. Winds were light. Runway 32 at Youngstown is 9,000 feet long, and the airport elevation is only 1,152 feet with a temperature of 19 degrees Celsius. Density altitude is not a factor in this accident. This aircraft could have easily performed at maximum gross weight out of this airport at this temperature, even on one engine. So looking at the preliminary ADS-B data from ADS-B Exchange, we only got a couple of data points. We show the first data point with the aircraft only obtaining 110 knots of ground speed well down the runway, and he's already off to the left of course, just right at 1,100 feet, which is near the field elevation. So he's gaining very little altitude at all. And if we look at each data point, the climber descent rate is either plus or minus 64 feet, 109 knots, 105 knots, 100 knots, 99 knots, and then 98 knots at the last data point without gaining hardly any altitude. If we take the KML data from down here and put it into Google Earth, this is what it looks like. Just riding over the treetops over the freeway to the point of impact. One of the first things investigators will be looking for was this some sort of a flight controllability issue? Was a control lock left in the aircraft that prevented the crew from properly handling the aircraft? By the way, initial reports indicate that this aircraft was being flown by 2 fairly well experienced pilots. Quick look at the performance data indicates that this takeoff should have occurred no problem at this elevation and at this airport with a max gross weight of 9,850 pounds, which this aircraft may very well have been very close to. With 6 people on board and full fuel, that would put it very close to its max gross weight. Down here at, let's call it 2,000 feet and 20 degrees Celsius, your normal takeoff distance would only be something on the order of a ground roll of about 2,200 feet. The accelerate stop distance, which you need to figure for all of these multi-engine takeoffs, would have been no problem either. Even if you use a pressure altitude of 2,000 feet, correct that for density altitude temperature of 20 degrees, that should give you a accelerate stop distance of 4,140 feet. In other words, the aircraft could have easily stopped in the remaining amount of runway if the crew elected to reject the takeoff. The accelerate go distance, which you also need to figure, you take these 2 numbers into consideration to come up with your balanced field length. Again, a pressure altitude of about 2,000 feet. Assume an engine failure at 98 knots at maximum gross weight of 9,850, 20 degrees Celsius, and your accelerate go distance is about 4,460 feet. Again, no problem for a 9,000 foot runway. But if you lose an engine on takeoff, you have to consider the following. The wing flaps got to be in the takeoff position, and the propeller is feathered and the landing gear is retracted during the climb. If you do not get the propeller correctly feathered, all of this data is out the window. If there was some sort of engine failure on takeoff with the aircraft properly configured with the gear up, the inoperative engine feathered, and the operative engine at takeoff power at max gross weight at 20 degrees Celsius up to, let's say, a pressure altitude of 2,000 feet and maximum gross weight, should give you something on the order of 700 feet per minute rate of climb. And the initial climb gradient while you're waiting to get the gear up, in other words, with the gear down and the flaps at takeoff and a climb speed of 100 knots, and the inoperative engine feathered and the operative engine at takeoff power at 20 degrees Celsius, 2,000 feet, run it across to max gross weight, should get you a climb rate just under 300 feet per minute. So you're going to go from 300 feet per minute up to 600 or 700 feet per minute by getting the aircraft cleaned up on one engine. Taking a closer look at this ground speed data on the ADS-B data, if we look at that wind 080 at 4 knots and we're departing runway 32, that gives you a slight tailwind of just 2 knots. The POH for the 441 has the following speeds: a VMCA of 91 knots, an intentional single engine speed of 98 knots, and a one engine inoperative best rate of climb, blue line, of 120 knots. And on the engine failure procedure, it directs you to initially start out at 110 knots. So this crew did just barely make the initial 110 knots, close to it, indicated airspeed based on what we can determine from this ADS-B data, plus or minus the winds. But they never did make it up to their one engine blue line speed, one engine best rate of climb speed. But the question I have for you experienced Conquest pilots is the rate of acceleration on this takeoff. To only have 110 knots at 7,000 feet down the runway, shouldn't this Conquest, even at max gross weight, have accelerated better at this point? And this is one thing that's not often taught in light twin-engine aircraft, or even medium-sized twin-engine aircraft, is an acceleration check speed. To make your data good, you need some point along the runway, some known distance and some known indicated airspeed to determine that you are accelerating properly down the runway and that there's not something wrong that's slowing you down excessively. And this is something we had to do in the T-38s in the Air Force, and we also, if I recall correctly, we also did it in the C-130s when flying for the Air National Guard, and it's something that I still practice to this day. So investigators will first look to see if there's any problem with the flight controls, any sort of control lock that could have prevented the crew from flying the aircraft. Then they're going to look very closely at the configuration of the aircraft at the point of impact. Was the gear up or down? Where were the flaps? Then they're going to look at the power levers in the cockpit. If they can determine this, what was the setting for the power levers and the condition levers? Then they're going to start looking for the possibility of an engine failure. The way this data looks, the pull to the left with very little climb seems to indicate a problem with the left engine, potentially. The Cessna Conquest is powered by the Garrett TPE 331 series of direct drive turboshaft engines, the same engine that's also used with a different dash number in the OV-10 Broncos here by CAL FIRE at my local airport. So this engine starts out with a two-stage centrifugal flow compressor, and then it looks like a three-stage turbine, and all of this machinery operates at nearly 40,000 RPM and then is directly connected and driven to the propeller reduction unit, which brings the RPM down to about 2,000 RPM, a reasonable RPM for the propeller. And there's a number of safety systems built into this engine to help you out in the event of an engine failure. From a pilot's perspective, this aircraft has a couple of power levers, one for each engine, and a pair of condition levers to manage the propeller. Note that there's no feather condition. It's called, on this aircraft, it's called emergency shutoff, which effectively does the same thing, feathers the propeller. The power levers go from max to flight idle, then ground idle, then reverse. Another thing investigators will be looking at is the possibility, and we've seen this before, of one of these power levers creeping back, somebody not managing the store and keeping those power levers all the way up there. Then the condition levers for the prop, full forward is takeoff, climb, and landing, then cruise, then start and taxi, then emergency shutoff all the way back, that red band, which is the same as feather. It's very important to get the propeller of a failed engine into the feathered condition, straight into the slipstream as indicated right here, in order to make the data good to minimize the drag of the windmilling propeller. If the propeller does not feather like this, it windmills and creates a tremendous amount of drag, and you will not meet your performance requirements, and you will not climb away from the ground. Here's a good example of a drag curve. By the way, this is a Australian Transportation Safety Board accident report of a different Cessna Conquest, but here's your feathered position, the minimal amount of drag, and then the huge amount of parasite drag you get from a windmilling propeller shown up here. Now, because this is a direct drive turboshaft engine, the engine must always be driving the propeller. This engine does not tolerate well the propeller attempting to drive the engine, and so it has a thing called a NTS, or negative torque sensing system, which will drive the propeller to a higher and higher pitch angle if the propeller begins to try to drive the engine. Now, in the event of an engine failure, this will drive the negative torque system, the NTS, to a very high pitch, but it will not automatically feather the propeller for you. The pilot must eventually feather the propeller to meet his performance requirements. But the NTS will begin to help you in the event of an engine failure on takeoff initially. And this NTS system is all done automatically. It does it by dumping the oil out of the dome of the propeller. And you do need to test this system prior to the first flight of each day. Make sure it's working correctly. Another question for investigators is, what was the mode of the fuel control system? The Cessna Conquest has a normal mode of fuel control and a manual mode of fuel control. You can operate the aircraft in manual mode, but there's a whole lot of conditions and differences when you're operating the fuel system in manual mode. In normal mode, you've got an electronic fuel control managing the fuel flow to the engine and keeping the engine parameters within limits. So if we go to Section 4 of the POH, there's a series of systems checks that you need to do prior to the first flight of each day that gives you an idea of the complexity of these engines and the systems that are built into them. First, we have the electronic fuel control high power monitor check, where we're checking the normal or automatic feature of the electronic fuel control. After that, we check the NTS, the negative torque system. Following that, we have an overspeed governor check, making sure that the engine speeds stay within parameters. Next, we have a manual mode fuel control check if we need to operate the aircraft in manual mode. And again, check the manual mode, the overspeed governor in manual, make sure that's working. And then you're on to check the trim and flight control systems and autopilot of the aircraft. Despite all this complexity, an engine failure on takeoff is pretty standard. Identify, verify, feather, and secure. These items in the box you got to have memorized. Aileron and rudder control, fly the aircraft. You've got to hold that aircraft into the operational engine 3 to 4 degrees with 3 to 4 degrees of bank and a little bit of slip. Power levers, make sure they're at takeoff power. Get that gear up. You've got to get the gear up. Your data will not be good. And initially pitch for 110 knots. Once you've determined the dead engine, dead foot, dead engine, feather it. Condition lever emergency shutoff. That will or should feather the propeller. Then firewall shutoff, push to close. Then they have you accelerate to 115 knots. Get the flaps up. Now go for blue line, 120 knots. Blue line with the flaps up. Adjust the trim, and then you can finish the cleanup items on the engine shutdown. But this is critical stuff that's got to happen very quickly. And on the expanded section of the emergency procedures, here's the big warning that the propeller on the in-op engine must be feathered, landing gear and wing flaps retracted per the engine failure procedures in order to obtain the performance shown in Section 5. If you don't get this right, you're not going to maintain flight. Or if something prevents you from getting the aircraft properly configured, that ain't good either. So this is some of the important details investigators will be looking at in the crash of November 441 Lima Sierra last Sunday. Thank you so much for your support of this channel, especially the folks over on Patreon that make this content possible. See you here.